Let's start with a modern paradox that honestly every practitioner listening to this has probably wrestled with at like 3 a.m. on a really difficult shift.
Oh, absolutely. The classic 3 a.m. existential dread.
Right, because we operate in systems that spend billions upon billions of dollars on, the most advanced clinical medicine the world has ever seen.
Yeah, robotic surgery, targeted biological therapies, those incredibly sophisticated intensive care units.
Exactly. And yet, despite all of that immense capital and technological firepower, you can drive, say, 5 miles across certain major cities and watch the average life expectancy just plummet by 10 or 15 years.
It's staggering, all that acute medical brilliance, and yet the overall health of certain populations is actually moving backwards.
Which is just, it's the defining frustration of modern medicine. We are incredibly good at treating the acute manifestation of a disease, but we are just failing to address the environment that generated the disease in the first place.
Yeah, we really are. Which brings us to a foundational metaphor in public health. This was originally coined by the medical sociologist Irving Zola.
Oh, the river metaphor. I love this one.
It's so good. So imagine a rushing, violent river. You're standing on the bank, and you see people continually falling into the water, fighting the current, and drowning.
And traditional clinical medicine, like the biomedical model we are all so deeply trained in, is basically the act of jumping in and pulling those drowning people out of the water, one by one.
Right. It's acute, it's heroic, it's absolutely necessary, and it is endlessly, endlessly exhausting.
Yeah. And then traditional health education, on the other hand, is like standing on the riverbank with a megaphone, just shouting instructions on how to swim better.
Or maybe handing out waterproof pamphlets on water safety as people drift by.
Right. Neither of which actually stops the people from falling in.
Exactly. But health promotion. Health promotion is traveling miles upstream.
It's the architectural, engineering, and frankly political work of figuring out exactly why people are falling in the first place.
Yeah, it's rebuilding the crumbling bridges, passing laws about riverbank safety, and most crucially, giving the community the actual tools and resources to govern the river themselves.
Which perfectly sets the stage. Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is an intensive, uncompromising exploration of Chapter 6.4 from the Oxford textbook of Global Public Health.
Titled Health Promotion, Health Education, and the Public's Health by Simon Carroll and Marcia Hills.
And we are going to use that chapter to really challenge the foundational assumptions of how we all practice. The text cites Ilona Kickbush, who was a huge pioneer in the modern health promotion movement.
She was, and she argued back in 1989 that health promotion is not just doing what we used to do, but, with nicer brochures or savvier social media campaigns.
Right, it's a radical departure. It heralds what she called a new public health.
And I want to speak directly to you, the listener, right now. Whether you are a medical student cramming for exams, a junior doctor just trying to survive the wards, or a practicing clinician trying to understand why your patients keep returning with the exact same preventable issues.
This deep dive is built for you. We're not just going to read you the textbook. We're going to build out your conceptual frameworks.
We want to clarify the complex reasoning behind these theories, decode the dense academic language, and support an active reading of this incredibly vital chapter. We're looking at health promotion as upstream engineering.
I love that framing. So to be effective upstream engineers, we first have to agree on what we're actually trying to build, right?
Yep.
We have to fundamentally redefine what we mean by health.
Exactly, and understand the core philosophy of empowerment that drives this entire movement.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the basic definition. If you look at the 1986 Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion, which is really the foundational text for this whole era, it defines health promotion simply as the process of enabling people to increase control over and to improve their health.
It sounds entirely reasonable, noble even, but the chapter warns us that we are immediately stepping into highly contested waters with that sentence.
Yeah, the ambiguity lies entirely in how a practitioner or a government interprets those words. To clarify this, the authors bring in the expanded definition from the 1998 Health Promotion Glossary.
And this edition is crucial. It states that health promotion represents a comprehensive social and political process.
Right. It explicitly moves beyond just strengthening the skills of individuals, like, teaching them to cook healthier meals, and embraces action directed towards changing social, environmental, and economic conditions.
I really want to pause on that word process, because in a clinical setting, a process is almost always a protocol. It's an algorithm.
Yeah, like if patient presents with symptom A, run test B, prescribe medication C. It's highly technical.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is that the text explicitly warns against reducing health promotion to merely a technical function. You cannot algorithm your way to community empowerment.
Right. The process described in the Ottawa Charter is a values-based process of communicative interaction. It is grounded in the ethical foundation of respect for human dignity and autonomy.
It represents an intentional, definitive shift away from the traditional, paternalistic public health models where the professional simply dictates behavior to the masses.
So it's not about transferring your supposedly superior knowledge to a community that you presume to be lacking. It is about negotiating values and power.
Yes, which brings up a reality that can be very, very uncomfortable for us as clinicians. We are not neutral actors.
Oh, definitely not. We do not walk into a clinic or a community town hall as objective blank slates. We carry a massive amount of baggage.
Our assumptions, our biases, and a whole worldview shaped by years of rigorous, hierarchy-driven professional training.
And acknowledging that baggage is the first step. The text details a framework from Hartrick and colleagues from 1994, which outlines the internal convictions necessary to truly act in health-promoting ways.
Yeah, they don't just call it a strategy, they call it a way of being. The core assumptions include a deep belief that all people have inherent strengths and are capable of finding their own answers.
It requires valuing diversity positively, not just tolerating it. But honestly, the most radical assumption is the belief that people without formal power or medical degrees have just as much capacity to assess their own needs as the powerful experts do.
Exactly. They are the undeniable experts on their own lived reality.
Let's ground this in a real ward or a busy family practice.
Right.
How often do we get frustrated by a quote-unquote non-compliant patient?
Oh, all the time. You tell them to manage the diabetes, give them the insulin sliding scale, and they come back with their A1C through the roof.
And the biomedical instinct is to assume they are either uneducated or just unmotivated. But the Hartrick framework demands we flip that entirely. We have to assume they are capable, and therefore something in their environment or their resources or our relationship with them is failing.
And that leads directly to another key assumption in the framework regarding empowerment. Empowerment is often discussed as an internal psychological state, just making someone feel more confident.
Right.
But the text argues empowerment is actually an intentional effort to create more equitable relationships in the real world. It means creating greater equality in resources, status, and authority.
So shared power relations don't erase the health professional's clinical expertise, but that expertise is deployed in new ways to facilitate power equity, rather than just to command compliance.
Yeah, but I'll be honest, I have to push back on this terminology a bit. If we, representing the medical establishment or the state, are enabling people to take control, doesn't that inherently imply that we still own all the power? Ooh, that's a good point. It feels like we are just graciously deciding to lease a little bit of it back to the community. Like the power dynamic hasn't fundamentally shifted. It's just been given a friendlier coat of paint.
That is a highly perceptive critique, and it is one the chapter itself grapples with heavily. There is a deep, lingering ambiguity here. Enabling was the favored term back at the time of the Ottawa Charter, but over time, empowerment took over precisely to signify a more genuine shift in control.
Rather than just a top-down allowance.
Right. However, the authors point out the immense and constant danger of what they call pseudo-participation.
Pseudo-participation. Like hosting a single community town hall, letting people vent for an hour, and then checking a bureaucratic box that says community consulted while you go ahead and implement the plan you already wrote anyway.
That is the exact mechanism. It is the risk of retaining tight paternalistic control over the complex macro-scale policy decisions, leaving those strictly to the financial and medical experts, while restricting public participation to superficial, low-stakes projects. The text cites Fran Baum's work from 2007 here, doesn't it?
Yes. She warns that the modern rhetoric of empowerment very frequently masks a continuing bureaucratic and professional dominance. And we have to recognize the harm in this.
Because if participation isn't genuine, it disproportionately damages the disadvantaged. The privileged can usually navigate the bureaucracy anyway. If the system is rigged, someone with resources can hire a lawyer, talk to their local representative, or just pay out of pocket to bypass the friction.
Exactly. But marginalized groups are left having solutions imposed upon them under the guise of collaboration, which is deeply alienating and a direct assault on their human dignity.
This entire shift in power dynamics, from top-down paternalism to genuine, messy, democratic empowerment, relies completely on how a society conceptualizes the word health in the first place.
And to understand how we conceptualize health today, we have to trace how we got here. The chapter outlines three major paradigms of health that have evolved over the last century.
It is vital you understand these, because the paradigm you operate within dictates exactly how you will intervene. If your definition of health is narrow, your intervention will be narrow.
Right. So the first paradigm discussed is the biomedical approach. This was the absolute dominant force of the 20th century, and for good reason. It was largely born out of the massive successes of sanitation engineering and the germ theory of disease.
In this paradigm, health was implicitly defined in the negative. It was simply the absence of disease or infirmity.
And if health is just the absence of disease, your intervention strategy is incredibly straightforward. It focuses on finding the disease and neutralizing it.
You rely on surgery, pharmaceuticals, and professionally managed illness care. It is an approach entirely centered on the clinical healthcare system. But the text notes, we hit a wall with this approach in the 1970s.
We did. We were spending way more money, but overall population health, particularly life expectancy related to chronic conditions, was plateauing.
Which brings us to the pivotal moment of 1974 and the Lalonde Report. Produced by the Canadian Department of Health and Welfare under Marc Lalonde, this document was historically explosive.
It was the first high-level national government document anywhere in the world to officially advocate health promotion as a basic central strategy. It birthed the second paradigm, the behavioral or lifestyle approach.
Why was a government report from the 70s so revolutionary for the field, though?
Because it openly officially acknowledged that healthcare systems, hospitals, clinics, doctors play only a remarkably small part in actually determining the health of a population.
Wow. And the Lalonde Report identified 4 broad determinants within the health field: human biology, healthcare organization, environment, and lifestyle.
But the text mentions it became known almost exclusively as the lifestyle approach. Why did the other 3 determinants get completely sidelined?
Honestly, it was a matter of political and economic convenience. Human biology was largely seen as fixed at the time. Reforming healthcare organization was a massive political battle.
And tackling the environment, meaning the social, economic, and physical conditions people lived in, required taking on really powerful industrial and corporate interests.
So the focus narrowed intensely onto lifestyle. It zeroed in on individual behavioral risk factors like smoking, diet, exercise, and alcohol consumption.
And while focusing on lifestyle seems intuitive, the chapter highlights a really fascinating civil war that erupted within the Lalonde framework, the divide between science and health promotion.
It basically set up this long-standing, frustrating dichotomy. Epidemiology and biostatistics were positioned as the objective, hard science foundation.
Right, and health promotion, on the other hand, was viewed as this softer, values-based action you take when the science hasn't given you a definitive answer yet.
That split plagued the field for a decade. It created a hierarchy where epidemiologists identified the risks, and health promoters were just the messenger sent out to tell people to stop engaging in risky behaviors.
But this paradigm was ultimately insufficient because telling someone to change their lifestyle without changing their environment is often an exercise in futility.
Which paved the way for the third paradigm, crystallizing with the Ottawa Charter in 1986, the socio-ecological approach.
And the socio-ecological approach completely throws out the idea that health is just the absence of disease. It redefines health not as the objective of living, but as a resource for everyday life.
It is a positive dynamic concept that emphasizes social and personal resources alongside physical capacities. Think about the implications of that shift.
Yeah, if health is a resource for everyday life, then health promotion is about ensuring everyone has access to that resource. The intervention strategies shift completely away from just clinical care or behavioral nagging.
The principal strategies become personal empowerment, community organization, and political action. But for you listening right now, walking the halls of a hospital or working in a community clinic, it is crucial to recognize that we haven't simply moved sequentially from one paradigm to the next.
Right. All 3 of these models exist simultaneously today. You will see the biomedical model in the trauma bay of the ER. You will see the behavioral model in an outpatient smoking cessation clinic.
And you will see the socio-ecological model in a community housing initiative championed by public health nurses. Recognizing which paradigm you or your institution are operating within is the absolute first step in effective systems thinking.
Exactly. And fully grasping that socio-ecological definition is what allows us to move out of philosophical theory and into the actual implementation of upstream architecture.
So how do we actually implement this in the messy real world? This transitions us to the practical machinery of the Ottawa Charter. Think of it as the engine of action.
The Charter provides us with three core strategies, three verbs that govern everything a health promoter does: advocate, enable, and mediate.
We've spent a lot of time on enabling and empowering. Advocacy is relatively straightforward, representing the push for public policy changes, though it is always fraught with political tension. But mediation. I found the text's take on mediation to be deeply unsettling.
Oh, it is a stark warning. The official definition of mediation sounds completely benign. It is about reconciling different interests in society to promote health. But the authors caution that professionals must be incredibly, almost obsessively reflexive when stepping into a mediator role.
Let's translate reflexive for a second. We mean constantly examining your own role, your own biases, and how your presence alters the dynamic, right?
Yes. And if you lack that reflexivity, you fall into the hidden trap of mediation. If your primary goal as a professional is simply reconciliation or keeping the peace, you might end up papering over a deep structural conflict just for the sake of short-term quiet.
You calm everyone down, but you leave the root causes of the injustice completely intact.
And the text warns that this breeds massive long-term embitterment within the community.
And there's an even darker side to it. If you have a conflict between a powerful entity, say a massive industrial polluter, and a powerless entity, like a marginalized local neighborhood, if you, as the public health official, mediate a compromise, you're almost always going to inadvertently reinforce the status quo.
The powerful give up a tiny fraction of their leverage. The powerless are told to be grateful for the scrap, and the systemic inequality is cemented in place.
And we, as professionals, naturally gravitate toward this because we have very little personal, financial, or career incentive to radically restructure the power relations of our society.
It is a profound institutional blind spot. We think we are being neutral peacemakers, but we are functioning as pressure valves for an unjust system.
Now, those three verbs, advocate, enable, mediate, are the overarching strategies. To actually enact them on the ground, the Ottawa Charter outlines 5 priority action areas. These form the scaffolding of all modern health promotion.
Let's walk through these, starting with action area number 1, build healthy public policy.
This goes right back to the Lalonde realization that the vast majority of health determinants lie completely outside the jurisdiction of the Minister of Health. Therefore, policy levers in other sectors, taxation, fiscal measures, employment legislation, urban planning, agriculture, they must be coordinated.
The health sector plays a guiding role, but it requires deep intersectoral action. But the text is pretty blunt about our success rate here, isn't it?
Yeah, the authors note that while the rhetoric around healthy public policy is globally accepted at every major conference, the actual implementation has been miserably inadequate.
This is particularly true in an era characterized by global economic crises, austerity measures, and regressive fiscal policies. When budgets get tight, intersectoral health policy is often the first thing abandoned in favor of short-term economic growth.
Which brings us to action area number 2, create supportive environments. This is the absolute core of the socio-ecological approach. It's about ensuring that the natural and built environments are safe, stimulating, satisfying, and enjoyable.
But there is a massive philosophical tension buried here between complex expert knowledge and democratic participation. The text uses health impact assessments, or HIAs, as the primary example of this tension.
Let's say a new multi-lane highway or a massive mining project is proposed near a residential area. Who decides if the resulting environment will be supportive?
We, as experts, love to use tools like HIAs. We gather data, run models, calculate particulate matter, project noise pollution, and reduce all this incredible social complexity down to a metric to calculate what is quote-unquote best for overall population health.
And from a classical utilitarian perspective, which we will dig into deeply later, experts might look at the data and decide that the economic benefit to the region outweighs the localized health detriment. They might decide that local needs should be ignored for the greater good.
But the authors of this chapter argue fiercely that health promotion must inherently err on the side of community autonomy. The community must have a decisive voice in shaping their environment, not just a consultative one.
Even if the community vehemently disagrees with the experts, like what if the experts know, factually, that a policy will cause harm, but the community wants it for the jobs?
Especially then. Deliberative politics is incredibly messy. People disagree, they get angry, they might be influenced by misinformation, and they might even seem wrong to the professionals holding the data.
Right.
But excluding the powerless from determining the goals of their own environment ensures they will forever be left behind. The text argues that the ends, even if it's improved health metrics, do not justify non-participatory autocratic means.
Wow. Okay. And that leads directly into action area number 3, strengthening community action. When I look at this area, I immediately connect it to the concept of community development.
In fact, the text explicitly links the two, stating that strengthening community action essentially is community development. And to give this concept some solid grounding, the text introduces Meredith Minkler's 5 principles of community organization from 1990.
Which are empowerment, community competence, participation, issue selection, and creating critical consciousness.
I really want to pin critical consciousness for a moment because we are going to dive deep into that when we talk about education. Let's hit action area number 4, develop personal skills.
This involves providing information, formal education, and enhancing life skills. But again, I have to stop and ask a question that haunts a lot of modern public health work.
Go for it.
If we focus our funding and our energy on individuals and their personal skills, aren't we just engaging in highly sophisticated victim blaming? Like telling a single mother to simply eat better or practice mindfulness when she lives in a severely deprived socioeconomic area, a known food desert, and works 3 jobs just to pay rent?
It's a massive concern.
Isn't focusing on her skills just ignoring the systemic violence of her reality?
That is a pervasive fear in the field today, and the text addresses it directly, citing the researcher Godin from 2007. Health promoters often shy away from the personal skills pillar for exactly the reason you just articulated. They are terrified of feeding into a neoliberal victim-blaming culture where structural failures are framed as personal moral failings.
Right.
However, the authors argue that entirely ignoring the development of personal skills is a massive strategic mistake.
Wait, how so? If the system is the problem, why focus on the individual?
Yeah. Because it is not a zero-sum game between individual empowerment and community empowerment. Genuinely empowering health education that builds critical self-esteem, literacy, and functional capacity actually works against victim blaming.
Okay, I see.
It gives people the immediate tools they need to survive and advocate for themselves. If we abandon personal skills entirely, we leave vulnerable individuals completely stranded in their daily lives while we sit back and wait for massive systemic macroeconomic change that may take decades to materialize.
That makes profound sense. You need the macro architecture, but you also need to give people life rafts while the bridge is being built.
Exactly. Which brings us to the final action area, number 5, reorient health services. This means moving the massive apparatus of the health sector beyond just providing clinical and curative services.
And here we have to differentiate between 2 terms that are constantly and incorrectly used interchangeably in hospitals and policy meetings: primary care and primary health care.
This is a vital distinction for any clinician listening. Primary care is generally what we think of as the first point of medical contact, your local GP clinic, an urgent care center. It is predominantly clinical, curative, and individualized.
While primary health care, on the other hand, refers to a much broader philosophy, specifically the philosophy outlined in the landmark 1978 Alma Ata Declaration. Let's list those Alma Ata principles because they are the constitutional bedrock of this idea.
They include universality, accessibility, community participation, intersectoral integration, essentiality, and equity.
So primary health care fundamentally resists the artificial separation of treatment from prevention. It demands that health services be deeply integrated with housing authorities, education boards, and employment sectors.
And the text references Kickbush again here, making a very powerful, almost aggressive point regarding the reorientation of services. Health promoters have already definitively proven the effectiveness of their upstream approach through massive population-level shifts in things like smoking cessation and cardiovascular nutrition over the last few decades.
Therefore, she argues, the burden of proof no longer lies with health promotion.
What does that mean for the medical establishment?
It means the accountability and the burden of proof must now lie with the medically dominated health system. The hospital system must prove why it is not integrating health promotion into its core operations, rather than health promoters constantly having to justify their existence to hospital administrators.
Wow. The medical system needs to prove why it isn't doing health promotion. That is a total inversion of the usual budget meeting dynamics.
Absolutely. Now, to successfully enact these 5 action areas, policy, environments, communities, skills, and services, health promoters have to rely heavily on their historical roots in health education, specifically looking at how we actually communicate and teach.
Which brings us to the evolution of the movement itself. If we look closely at the evolution of health education, we see a discipline that had to undergo a painful, rigorous internal critique.
For a long time, the traditional approach was based on the health action model. The underlying assumption of this model was brilliantly simple and just entirely flawed. If you just gave people the right information and raised their awareness about a risk, they would naturally change their attitudes and then logically change their behavior.
It's the pamphlet theory of change. Just hand out a well-designed brochure on the dangers of sedentary lifestyles, and the problem is solved. People will start jogging.
Right. But the data showed this approach actually inadvertently exacerbated health inequalities. Why? Because information does not exist in a vacuum.
Only the prepared middle and upper classes had the financial resources, the leisure time, the safe neighborhoods, and the psychological bandwidth to quickly adopt the new behaviors, like buying organic diets or taking up exercise routines.
The information didn't help marginalized groups because it completely ignored their socioeconomic reality. You were giving them a map to a place they literally couldn't afford to travel to.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because to solve this spectacular failure of traditional top-down education, the text pivots away from medicine entirely. It introduces Paulo Freire, a legendary Brazilian educator, and his 1972 masterwork, Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Freire didn't care about health pamphlets. He cared about literacy and liberation among impoverished farmers in Brazil. He introduced the emancipatory education paradigm.
Freire's methodology is built on a cyclical, 3-stage process listening, participatory dialogue, and action. And the conceptual framework he uses to break this down is absolutely crucial for modern public health.
He strictly differentiates between what he calls problem solving and problem posing. I need you to break that down for us, because as clinicians, our entire identity is wrapped up in being expert problem solvers. A patient presents with a problem, we diagnose it, we prescribe the solution. It is what we are paid to do.
And that is exactly what Freire critiques. In Freire's paradigm, problem-solving seeks immediate, expert-driven solutions to a surface-level issue. The expert retains all the knowledge and power, dispensing a quick fix that maintains the overall power dynamic.
While problem posing deliberately does not seek an immediate technical solution, instead it uses what Freire calls generative themes. Recurring issues or frustrations drawn directly from the initial listening phase with the community to uncover the deep-root socioeconomic, political, and historical causes of a person's situation.
Let's build an analogy here. Suppose you are working in a community clinic and you notice incredibly high rates of pediatric asthma in one specific neighborhood.
Okay.
The problem-solving approach says, you have high rates of asthma, here's a massive grant for more albuterol inhalers and a class on how to use spacers. You solve the immediate clinical problem.
But the problem-posing approach sits down with the community and asks, why is it so hard for our children to breathe in this specific neighborhood?
Yes. And through participatory dialogue, the community uncovers the proximity to the new industrial highway, the lack of political leverage they had to stop the industrial zoning, and the historical redlining that trapped them in that zip code in the first place. It takes a clinical symptom and raises critical consciousness.
That is the perfect illustration. The ultimate goal of the dialogue is not just symptom management, it is critical thinking, allowing participants to uncover the systemic root causes of their place in society.
And applying this clinically or in community public health practice is incredibly demanding on the professional. You are no longer just prescribing, you are facilitating an awakening to injustice.
The text highlights Keith Tone's Holy Trinity of Counseling as the essential skill set for health promoters doing this: work, respect, empathy, and genuineness. But why are those specific, almost therapeutic counseling skills so vital for a public health practitioner dealing with systemic policy?
Because when you successfully use problem posing to uncover historical injustices and deep socioeconomic disparities, you are inevitably going to encounter immense, legitimate, and entirely justified anger from historically disadvantaged communities.
They realize the system isn't broken, it's working exactly as designed to disadvantage them.
Exactly. A professional who hides behind the shield of objective neutrality or clinical detachment will be completely unable to bridge the social gap. You have to genuinely empathize with and respect that anger to facilitate true, lasting empowerment. You cannot be a detached observer.
Which perfectly bridges us to the broader, often hidden political and philosophical tensions that govern modern public health. If we use Frere's model to uncover the political root causes of disease, we are forced to talk about the political economy of health itself.
We have to look at how governments value human life. The text refers to this era of realization as public health's fall from grace.
It is a highly provocative framing. The historical narrative usually suggests that in the mid-19th century, foundational figures like John Snow, Edwin Chadwick, and Rudolf Virchow operated with this incredible socio-environmental zeal.
They saw the undeniable connection between grinding poverty, horrific living conditions, and rampant infectious disease, and they fought for massive social reform.
Virchow famously declared, "Medicine is a social science, and politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale." He was out there studying typhus outbreaks and concluded the cure was political freedom and education.
Exactly. But then the standard story goes, public health lost its way. It fell into a restrictive, microscope-focused biomedical era, and later a narrow, nagging focus on individual risk factors.
And modern health promotion, the story claims, emerged in the 80s to reclaim that lost 19th century spirit. But the authors of this chapter present a much deeper, more critical analysis, referencing Kerr White's 1991 theory regarding the redefinings of the unacceptable.
I have to say, this specific concept completely blew my mind when I read it. The idea that public health didn't actually lose its way at all, but rather stayed terrifyingly true to its actual underlying philosophy from the very beginning.
Yeah. White argues that classical public health and the science of epidemiology share a fundamental philosophical DNA classical, liberal, reformist utilitarianism. They operate on an economic logic.
White points out that massive public health action in the 19th century was not driven purely by bleeding heart humanitarian idealism. It was driven by the cold, hard fact that disease was costing the emerging capitalist state too much money in lost industrial labor, military manpower, and economic productivity.
When the economic cost of an epidemic becomes too high, the suffering magically becomes unacceptable and visible to the state, prompting intervention.
Utilitarianism, the ethical doctrine of seeking the greatest good for the greatest number. It sounds logical, almost mathematically perfect for epidemiology, but it has a massive catastrophic blind spot when it comes to actual equity.
So I want you listening to think about what fair and just access to resources actually means in your practice. Because if we rely strictly on utilitarianism, we might logically, mathematically justify sacrificing the health of a small, marginalized minority if it marginally improves the overall average health of the majority.
Right, like if polluting a poor neighborhood brings cheap energy to 10 wealthy neighborhoods, utilitarianism might say that's a net win. And the philosophy of modern health promotion fundamentally rejects that math.
It absolutely rejects it. And this is where the text introduces the capabilities approach to social justice, developed by heavyweight philosophers like Martha Nussbaum and the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen.
This approach moves past earlier heavily debated theories, such as John Rawls' theory of justice, which focused heavily on the fair distribution of primary goods.
Let's do a quick translation for the junior doctor listening on their commute. How does the capabilities approach actually differ from just distributing resources fairly?
Well, in the capabilities approach, having resources isn't enough. It's about what you can actually do with them. The approach argues that the social basis for health, the fundamental prerequisites for living a healthy, dignified, autonomous life, are a primary capability that should be provided by right to every single human being at an absolute minimum standard.
So it's not about maximizing the average utility of a population.
No, it is about setting an absolute non-negotiable floor of dignity. It says everyone has a right to health capabilities, regardless of how much it costs the overall economic average to provide them.
That is a fundamental philosophical rupture from classical economistic public health. It says human health is a right, not just a labor resource. And if we accept the capabilities approach, we have to look unblinkingly at the political economy.
The text does not shy away from this at all. It argues that achieving the Ottawa Charter prerequisites for health, peace, shelter, food, a stable ecosystem, equity, is fundamentally dictated by global socioeconomic structures, namely global capitalism.
The authors argue that health promoters cannot just be health experts. They must understand the massive political and economic drivers of contemporary societies. They point to the absolute necessity of understanding state theory, referencing the political sociologist Bob Jessup's work from 2002.
You have to understand how the state actually operates, whose economic interests it truly serves, and how hegemonic projects are maintained, if you have any hope of changing policy.
Hold on, hegemonic projects. Let's pause and translate that. We are essentially talking about how dominant groups maintain power not just by force or laws, but by making their control seem like common sense or the natural order of things,
And you
right?
see it, exactly.
Like how the food industry spends billions to make highly processed, sugar-laden food seem like a normal, inevitable part of childhood, rather than a specific corporate project to maximize profit at the expense of metabolic health.
That is a perfect translation. A hegemonic project makes the unnatural seem natural, and the text insists we can't just view concepts like class and status as simple epidemiological variables on a spreadsheet.
We can't just say, oh, this zip code is lower income, so they have more heart disease, moving on. We have to view class and status as active, ongoing mechanisms of social reproduction.
Social reproduction meaning the systems, schools, housing markets, criminal justice, that are specifically designed to accumulate power and privilege for a few while reliably reproducing structural disadvantages for the rest, generation after generation.
If we ignore that engine of reproduction, we're just putting expensive biomedical band-aids on systemic bullet wounds.
Which brings up a massive existential crisis for the field. If the problems are this deeply systemic, this heavily entrenched in global political economy and in complex social reproduction, how on earth do we measure if our little health promotion interventions are actually working?
Right. If we aren't just measuring the binary, did this person quit smoking, but rather, did we shift the power dynamics and critical consciousness of this community, our traditional scientific tools feel incredibly inadequate.
Which brings us to the final major theme of the chapter, measuring the immeasurable, complexity, systems, and the future. There is a massive ongoing clash highlighted in the text between the messy, qualitative social science paradigm of health promotion and the rigid mathematical positivism of epidemiology and evidence-based medicine, or EBM.
Evidence-based medicine relies on the randomized controlled trial, the RCT, as the absolute, unquestionable gold standard for proving effectiveness. But the text details a profound structural critique of using RCTs to evaluate health promotion.
RCTs are beautifully designed to isolate a single independent variable in a highly controlled environment to prove linear causality. Drug X causes outcome Y.
I'll be honest, when I read this critique of evidence-based medicine, I bristled a bit. As clinicians, we worship the RCT. It's how we know we aren't practicing quackery. But the argument here is that a community is not a controlled environment.
Exactly. Community interventions are intrinsically complex, nonlinear, and emergent. If you introduce an empowerment initiative or a new urban green space in a neighborhood, it instantly interacts with the local municipal politics, the racial history of the town, the changing local economy, and the unique personalities of the community leaders.
You cannot isolate a single variable. The empiricist positivist approach of EBM, which assumes we can objectively measure reality by breaking it down into tiny, isolated parts, fundamentally struggles to account for these dynamic interactions within complex adaptive systems.
So what are the alternatives? If we are fighting for limited government funding, we can't just walk into a budget hearing and say, it's too complex to measure, you just have to trust us that empowerment works. We need evidence.
The text discusses several emerging sophisticated methodologies designed for complexity. One prominent alternative is realist reviews, championed by researchers like Ray Pawson.
Realist synthesis critiques the simple does it work question of EBM. Instead, it asks a much more nuanced set of questions. What works, for whom, in what circumstances, in what respects, and how?
There are also meta-narrative reviews that track how different disciplines understand a problem. But the most significant overarching shift is the adoption of systems thinking and complexity science.
Viewing interventions not as isolated mechanical gears, but as events within complex, living, adaptive systems.
Precisely. You don't evaluate the intervention in isolation. You evaluate how the intervention perturbs the broader system and how the system dynamically adapts to that perturbation.
And this complexity extends heavily into policy evaluation as well, particularly with the modern revival of intersectoral action through frameworks like health in all policies, or HIIP.
Health in all policies. The text notes Finland really championed this approach at the EU level in 2006, and there was the major Adelaide statement in 2010. It sounds utopian in theory. Every single government department thinks about health.
Transportation thinks about health when designing roads. Agriculture thinks about health when setting subsidies. But evaluating if that is actually happening.
The central challenge of health in all policies is a nightmare of governance. How do you manage and measure vertical governance aligning goals from the national level down to the municipal level and local NGOs, and horizontal governance, getting the Ministry of Finance to cooperate with the Ministry of Health?
Evaluating the success of HIHAL requires the analytical tools of political science, public administration, and economic sociology. You are evaluating massive institutional behavioral change, not just tracking population disease metrics.
And before we wrap up, we have to touch on the final modern frontier discussed in the chapter, the digital environment, specifically social media. It is the ultimate complex adaptive system.
It offers this incredible, unprecedented new platform for community empowerment. It is instantly interactive, it allows for bottom-up listening at a global scale, it facilitates virtual participation for the homebound, and provides massive platforms for grassroots health advocacy and activism.
It offers all of that, but the text issues a very strong, necessary caution. Social media is a razor-sharp, double-edged sword. It is simultaneously an unparalleled avenue for industry persuasion.
Vested corporate interests and purveyors of disinformation can promulgate specific, harmful viewpoints far more rapidly than public health institutions can counter them. Navigating this new environment requires a highly developed critical digital literacy among both health promoters and the general public.
So what does this all mean for us? We have journeyed from the Lalonde Report, recognizing that clinical medicine isn't enough, to the Ottawa Charter, building an architectural engine for socio-ecological change.
We've explored Freire's emancipatory education, the philosophical demand for capabilities-based social justice over cold utilitarianism, and finally, the need for complexity science to actually measure our impact.
Health promotion is ultimately an imperative to act ethically and justly in an unjust world. It is not just a toolkit of interventions. It is a profound moral stance.
If we synthesize the incredibly dense conclusion of the chapter, the authors leave us with 5 major takeaways to carry forward. First, health promotion is a complex, often ambiguous concept, deeply rooted in the Ottawa Charter's socio-ecological vision.
Second, it is inextricably connected to the radical revolution in health education and broader emancipatory social movements.
Third, it is fundamentally about ethics, values, and social justice, prioritizing equity, genuine participation, and structural empowerment.
Fourth, because it remains a professionally dominated field, practitioners must be relentlessly, reflexively critical of their own power and biases.
And fifth, to truly enable people to control the determinants of their health, health promotion cannot hide in the clinic. It must directly and bravely engage with political philosophy and the realities of the global political economy.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over on your next shift or your commute home. We talked about the capabilities approach, the radical idea that the social bases of health are a fundamental, non-negotiable human right, not subject to utilitarian math.
If we, as medical professionals, truly accept that philosophy, how does that reshape the oath we take as clinicians?
Does our duty of care end at the clinic door once the prescription is written? Or does it mandate our active vocal participation in local civic planning, environmental policy, and community empowerment? If health is fundamentally built upstream, can we ethically justify spending our entire careers staying safely on the riverbank?
That is a question every single practitioner must answer for themselves, and it will define the future of public health.
Let's lock in those mental frameworks. Here are your rapid-fire, single best answer recall prompts based on today's deep dive. I'll read the question, give you a second to pause and think, and then we'll give the answer in the specific section of Chapter 6.4 to revisit for your active reading.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Prompt 1. Which conceptual approach to health defines it as a resource for everyday life, rather than the objective of living, as outlined in the 1986 Ottawa Charter?
The socio-ecological approach. Revisit the section titled, What is the Health in Health Promotion?
Perfect. Prompt 2. In Paulo Freire's emancipatory education paradigm, what is the key difference between problem-solving and problem-posing?
Problem posing does not seek immediate, expert-driven technical solutions, but instead uses generative themes to raise critical consciousness about root socioeconomic, political, and historical causes. Revisit the section titled Health Education.
Excellent. Prompt 3. According to the text, what is the primary hidden danger for a health professional utilizing the Ottawa Charter strategy of mediation?
Reconciling conflict in a way that simply papers over root causes for short-term peace. ultimately reinforcing the structural position of the powerful at the expense of the powerless. Revisit the section titled The Ottawa Charter Strategies.
Spot on, prompt 4. The historically significant 1974 Lalonde Report identified 4 determinants of the health field. What are they?
Human biology, healthcare organization, environment, and lifestyle. Revisit the section titled What is the Health in Health Promotion?
Almost there. Prompt 5. How does the philosophy of primary healthcare, as defined by the 1978 Alma Ata Declaration, fundamentally differ from standard primary care?
Primary healthcare vehemently resists the separation of treatment and prevention, demanding intersectoral integration, community participation, and broad action on structural equity, rather than just delivering individualized curative medical care. Revisit the section titled Reorienting Health Services.
And finally, prompt 6. Why do many health promotion researchers heavily criticize the exclusive use of randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, and traditional evidence-based medicine to evaluate their interventions?
The empiricist positivism of EBM and RCTs struggles to account for the interactive, nonlinear, and emergent dynamics of causation that occur within complex adaptive systems and messy social contexts. Revisit the section titled Complexity, Context, and Causality in Health Promotion Research. Here are the details of this episode.
Health promotion and education. Byline: from information to transformation, empowering individuals and communities to take control of their health. Episode description. In this episode, Medlock Holmes moves from measuring populations to mobilizing them. Health promotion is not simply about delivering information. It is about enabling people to improve and sustain their well-being. Holmes begins by revisiting the foundational principles of modern health promotion, including the shift from disease treatment to empowerment and prevention. We explore the influence of the Ottawa Charter and the concept of creating supportive environments, strengthening community action, and building healthy public policy. The episode examines core strategies of health education. The episode examines core strategies of health education. Behavior change communication. The episode examines core strategies of health education. Community participation. The episode examines core strategies of health education. Social marketing. The episode examines core strategies of health education. School-based interventions. The episode examines core strategies of health education. Media campaigns. The episode examines core strategies of health education. Holmes highlights the importance of tailoring interventions to cultural context, literacy levels, and social realities. Information alone rarely changes behavior. Sustainable impact requires motivation, opportunity, and supportive systems. The episode examines core strategies of health education. We also explore evaluation. How do we measure whether health promotion efforts actually change outcomes? Holmes discusses process indicators, outcome indicators, and long-term impact assessment. The episode examines core strategies of health education. Health promotion is both science and art. It requires evidence-based strategy and deep understanding of human behavior. The episode examines core strategies of health education. In public health, prevention is not passive. It must be actively cultivated. The episode examines core strategies of health education. The episode examines core strategies of health education. Health promotion focuses on empowerment and prevention. The episode examines core strategies of health education. Behavior change requires more than knowledge alone. The episode examines core strategies of health education. Community engagement strengthens intervention effectiveness. The episode examines core strategies of health education. Social marketing can influence population behaviors. The episode examines core strategies of health education. Cultural tailoring improves uptake and sustainability. The episode examines core strategies of health education. Evaluation is essential for measuring impact. The episode examines core strategies of health education. Health promotion operates at individual, community, and policy levels.